The formal study of apparitions, from the chapter Apparitions, Characteristics and Parallels, found in The Resurrection of Jesus by Dale C. Allison, Jr. The last few decades have witnessed a revolution in the study of this subject. To tell the story, however, we must go back to the 19th century. The English Society for Psychical Research undertook in 1882 a survey of so-called paranormal experiences among the British population. Their questionnaire, which was the grandparent of all modern public polling, was sent to approximately 17,000 people. It asked, among other questions, "Have you ever, when believing yourself to be completely awake, had a vivid impression of seeing or being touched or hearing a voice? Which impression, so far as you could discover, was not due to any external cause?" Of the 15,316 replies, about 10% replied in the affirmative, a number that is, given what we now know, surprisingly small. Among the 10%, 163 reported the apparition of an individual within 24 hours of death. In the follow-up to those 163, fully 9% claimed that their vision was shared. One or more persons witnessed the apparition with them. After this early survey and Eleanor Sidgwick's subsequent major study, several writers, such as the French astronomer Camille Flammarion, dabbled in collecting stories of apparitions and conducted interviews with percipients. The gathering and analysis of relevant testimony was pretty much confined to the parapsychologists until the middle of the 20th century, when psychologists, medical doctors, and sociologists slowly began to warm to the subject. In 1944, E. Lindemann, in an article for the American Journal of Psychiatry, noted that several of his patients in bereavement saw their dead loved ones. In 1958, Peter Maris, in Widows and Their Families, reported that 36 of the 72 London widows he interviewed reported a strong sense of presence, SOP, of a dead family member. In 1970, Colin Murray Parkes, in the journal Psychiatry, reported that 15 of the 22 widows he spoke with were likewise familiar with SOP, and that often it was all too real. Also in 1970, another study, this one from Japan, reported that 18 of 20 women who had been suddenly widowed had experienced SOP. Half had seen their dead husbands. These small studies were eclipsed when Derry Rees, a British medical doctor, wrote his dissertation at the University of London in 1971 and reported his findings in the British Medical Journal. Rees discovered that, of the 293 widows and widowers he interviewed, fully 47% of them believed that they had experienced contact with their dead spouse. Most of these encounters took place not long after death, but there were also intermittent occurrences years later. A fair percentage of these encounters were full-fledged apparitions. Rhee's work caught the eyes of other researchers, and the time since has witnessed a plethora of similar surveys and related popular works. The upshot is that in study after study, and from different regions of the globe, we have learned that at least half of all widows and widowers believe that they have run into their dead spouses, that is, have seen them and or heard them and or felt their presence. This is clearly a normal, non-pathological part of the mourning process. We have also learned that such contact is not confined to surviving partners or those in mourning. Indeed, all parts of the general public report a high incidence. Surveys from Western Europe and North America vary anywhere from about 10% to 40% of apparent contact with the dead through dreams, voices, felt presences, as well as visions while wide awake. These experiences are often experienced as very vivid and very real. Furthermore, the relevant reports, which come from all age groups, children relate these experiences as do teenagers, often have nothing to do with the grieving process. How far-flung such experiences are appears from the fact that in the United States at the end of the 20th century, fully 30% of those disbelieving in an afterlife reported feeling at least once, as though I was in touch with someone who had died. Most striking of all, surveys regularly uncover people who claimed that their experience was shared with others, that more than one person saw an apparition, or heard a disembodied voice, or felt a presence. Another result of some interest is that religious faith is not a necessary prerequisite for these experiences. Sometimes, on the contrary, people are moved to change their attitude toward death and their opinions about the hereafter. Personal experiences of the author and his family. Perhaps it is not out of line here to relate my own experiences. One of my best friends was, in 1987, tragically run over by a drunk driver. After several weeks in a coma, she, along with her unborn baby, died. It was about a week after this that I was, as it seemed to me, awakened in the middle of the night. There, standing at the end of my bed, was my friend Barbara. She said nothing, she was simply there. Her appearance did not match the traditional lore about ghosts. She was not faint or transparent or frightening. She was, to the contrary, beautiful, brightly luminous, and intensely real. Her transfigured, triumphant presence, which lasted only a few seconds, gave me great comfort. Although she said nothing, this thought entered my mind. This sight is ineffably beautiful, and any person in that state would be ineffably beautiful. Whatever the explanation, this is exactly what happened. This was not my only ostensible encounter with my deceased friend. One afternoon, several weeks later, I was typing in my study, in the full light of day, wholly focused on my work. Suddenly, I felt a strong physical presence which I sensed as being up, behind, and to my left. I knew immediately, I know not how, that this was Barbara. Unlike the first time when I saw something and heard nothing, this time I heard something and saw nothing. As clear as could be, my mind picked up the words, "You must go and see Warren, Barbara's distraught husband, right now." Overwhelmed by this communication out of the blue, I instinctively obeyed. I called Warren and made a late luncheon date. He seemed, in the event, to be doing as well as could be expected. There was no emergency that I could see. The voice, however, had been urgent, and I unhesitatingly heeded its request. I relate all this not so that others may believe that Barbara survived death and spoke to me, nor that readers might regard me as a fantasy-prone or a victim of mental dysfunction. The point is only that these things really happen, and in my case, I know this from first-hand experience. I also know how overwhelmingly real such events can seem. So real that I took them at the time to originate in something other than my subjectivity, and have difficulty thinking otherwise even now, decades later. Perhaps readers will indulge me further if I report on the series of events related to me after brain cancer dispatched my father, Cliff Allison, in the spring of 1994. My wife, Chris, was with him when he died. I was home with the children. When she returned from the hospital, one of the first things she told me was that shortly after the doctors declared him dead and left her alone with the body, his spirit somehow returned, hovered near the ceiling, and told her quite clearly that he was overjoyed at finally being free from all his ills. 3 or 4 days later, my 6-year-old son, Andrew, came to me one evening and told me that he had just seen Grandpa. My father, he said, had just now been sitting beside him on a bed, wearing his green bathrobe, the last piece of clothing Andrew had seen him in. My son, who responded to the experience rather matter-of-factly, then told me that Grandpa had shared with him a secret, and that he cannot tell anyone what it was. A few weeks after this, my brother John informed me that he had been walking down the street and had plainly heard our father's voice in his head. That voice instructed him about several matters, both personal and of a business nature. My brother had no doubt that the voice, which responded to questions, was real. When John asked, "What did you think of the funeral, Dad?" the voice said, "I don't know. I got lost." Months later, my brother told me that the voice had returned once more and asked him to call a certain individual and wish her happy birthday. Upon making the call, he learned it was indeed the woman's birthday. I shall not continue this narrative any further, except to note that my nephew David reported seeing my father at the intermittent, that my mother Virginia, months after my father's passing, claimed that he had made his presence known to her one night, that my daughter Emily, in 1995, had a vision of her grandfather while she was playing one afternoon in our backyard, and that I also heard from two people outside the family, Bill and Jane, of their alleged encounters with Clifford. I have inevitably thought of this series of reports when subsequently reading 1 Corinthians 15. Most of the stories were shared with me independently of each other, and if I were looking for reasons to believe in my father's survival of bodily death, I suppose I could compose a little list like Paul's and regard it as evidential. Clifford passed away in the hospital, after which he communicated to Chris, then he appeared to David, then he appeared to Andrew and spoke with him, then he gave guidance to John, after which his presence made itself felt to Bill, Virginia, and Jane, and last of all, he appeared to Emily. 6 of them are still alive, although 2 have died. Whether one regards my family's stories, or those like them, as a farrago of nonsense, as the hallucinatory projections of self-deceived mourners, or instead seriously reckons with the possibility that some of them were genuine encounters with the other side, the first point for historians of early Christianity is that the sorts of experiences just recounted are common, and they typically seem quite real to percipients. Moreover, different accounts from various times and sundry places show so many similarities that we are indubitably dealing with a phenomenon about which generalizations can be made, regardless of the ideology one advances.